Hi, my name is David, and today we're going to do another lecture in GraphQL Apollo Server, and we're going to do part one of resolvers. And this is following along the Apollo GraphQL documentation. So just to recap with how GraphQL works, is that first from the front end, we make a request of a query we want. So in this case, we want to see all the books with their title and author. So it hits Apollo Server. Apollo Server goes to resolvers to resolve this request. And then it goes to the type devs of what it has, and then gets the types, and then gets the data from the database, making sure that the types match. So in this case, we're making a query, and it sees the query here, and then the query here, and then the books goes to Apollo Server resolvers. The books part sees this, and then it returns a type book, and this is where it's defined. So then it goes, and then it's being returned books. So we get that information from our database, and this book type has to match what we're returning, and then what we get back has to match that book type. So now we're going to learn more about resolvers. So a resolver is a function that's responsible for populating the data for a single field in your schema. So we get a request, it sees it, and then it has the functionality to how to handle that request to return the appropriate data. So the syntax of it is that, so here we have the types. We're doing a query number 6 and query number 7. So I created a boilerplate GraphQL Apollo Server version 4 with the type devs, resolvers, having a server, and then starting a new instance of that server. So what we want to do is define the types first. So we can just copy here into our type devs. So we have the type of query number 6, and then we want it to return the number 6 every time it hits that. And then of course, number 6 is an int. And then we do the same thing for the number 7 query. We want to always return number 7. And in this case, we don't have to use our database because we know that we don't have to retrieve any data from it. We're just going to return 6 or 7. So how our resolvers are going to look like is that first we need a query here to match this query, and then number 6 here to match this, and then the int has to match the type we have to return. So in this case, it'll be 6. That 6 isn't defined here. It's just as long as it fits that data type, we're good. So we can just copy this. Great. And now we can start our server. Okay, so we have a query here that we can plus on it. And then we have the number 7 and number 6. So we can do the number 6 first. And then we can just make the query, and we should see 6 and then the type number 6. And then if we want number 7, we can add it as well. And that's how we resolve these two queries. So moving on. So we will have all our resolvers in this object. And it's saying that the resolvers need a top level field that matches. So in this case, it's talking about how the query has to match this query. And then the function belongs to the corresponding function. So now we can talk about arguments, because we see here, we're not passing through any arguments inside of our resolvers. So let's look at another example where we have a user type with an ID and a name, and then we're going to query a user by their ID. So let's copy this, and we can replace it here. Great. So now this, it affects what the data we have. So we can just use an in-memory data for this example. So we can copy here and paste it where we have two users, user ID 1, Elizabeth, and user ID 2, Fitz. Now we have to update our resolvers. So in this case, we have a query here that matches query here, and then it goes to user, and then user. And then as you see here, and it literally says in the documentation, there's 4 positional arguments: parent, args, context, value, and info. And for now, we can just focus on args. So args is whatever we get from this part. So in this case, we have an ID to map to and an ID. So the argument has a .id, we'll get that ID. So what we're doing is that we're doing users find. So we're looping through user for each user. We're finding where the ID that gets passed in matches from the argument, matches the ID from this user array. And so to also show you what the args is, we can add a console log. Args. Great. So now we can test this one out. Great. So we go to query, and now we see the user automatically gets generated. And here we're getting the user ID, and this $ indicates a variable. So first, let's focus on what we're getting returned back. So we can say ID and name. And then the user ID here has to match up with whatever. So this ID comes from here. So this user ID is the variable, and we can pass in a variable here. And in this case, we can see that we'll have to pass in the ID. So we can just do 1 for this case. In a string. And now we can make query, and we get Elizabeth Bennett. And then we can also change it to 2 to get the other user. And then if we do something that doesn't exist, we get a null. And then let me show you what happens in the console log. See, we get this object of ID to 1, ID to 2, ID to 4. And this ID comes from here. So that's how we do resolvers with args passed through our queries. And the next lesson, we can learn more about the other arguments, like the parent. Thank you so much.